The Middle Fraser Canyon is a region of the interior plateau that follows the Fraser River and includes both the river itself and the surrounding landforms, especially the hills and valleys that lead down to the river itself. This region has been occupied in various forms and levels of intensification for thousands of years. The cultural systems of the middle period of the Middle Fraser Canyon, which include both the Old Cordilleran and all three subsets of the Nesacep tradition, all live relatively mobile lifestyles. Archaeological sites that date to this time period often feature things like hearths but no permanent settlements. The reason why the people of the Middle Fraser Canyon live such a nomadic lifestyle is because they made their living in a relatively warm and hot climate. The dry ground and frequent forest fires made it hard for them to harvest things like camas or rely heavily on salmon, because the rivers didn't flow enough to give the fish the clear waters that they needed for spawning. However, the relatively open forest and dry ground was actually good for things like berries and edible roots, and made hunting a viable option. All of these things could only be used at certain times of the year, however, and sparingly at that. This made the hunter-gatherer, cyclical, and non-sedentary lifestyle more prominent and the most successful for this time period. For some time after this, during the late Middle Period and in the early pit house tradition, a rapidly changing climate made most food sources unreliable year after year. In order to combat this, groups of people began to live slightly more sedentary lifestyles, settling in areas called ecotones, which are adjacent to multiple sources of food. When one food source was unsuccessful, these people could more easily turn to another food source because they were staying in one area. Archaeological sites from this time period sometimes show evidence of small pit houses or more permanent residences. Finally, around 2,500 years ago, the more classical pit house tradition finally started to take hold. At this time, the long, cold winters of the Neoglacial period, which had caused much of the climatic shifts earlier, had lost much of their edge. Indeed, on average, winters were milder and drier than those of the Neoglacial period. These warmer periods made salmon spawning harder, as many smaller tributaries were closed off, and water conditions were too warm and too murky for many salmon until later in the year. This made the fish pool at mouths of large rivers until absolutely necessary, and this made fishing large numbers of salmon extremely easy for people. Many societies popped up along the mouths of major rivers, where large groups of fish could be found. These environmental conditions also made for patchy environments, where people could have access to the food sources of multiple different environments all at once. Because of all of this abundance, and access to a lot of different resources all at once, people were able to stay in one place and venture out to spots where they knew certain resources could be found, rather than having to travel over a whole landscape. Finally, as the climate began to even out and became closer to what it is today, salmon became more predictable and abundant, dry meadows had not yet begun to recede, and deer populations were probably stable. Again, this created an abundance which allowed for large groups of people to settle down and live together for large amounts of time.